It's a rather abstruse topic, which is one reason I'm so happy that Sherry Manning is teaching Torah on Friday nights. We should keep the deep teaching of Torah going. And one thing that this division of labor has done is allowed me to think about things on a little more theoretical level, things I like to teach, and then be able to do a little series. So let me just bring you up to date. Somebody told me they wanted to study Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy. I had an internal negative reaction. I shared a few thoughts, then I went back and I said to myself, why did that thought disturb me? Well, I remember studying Jewish theology in rabbinical school, and a very big part of Jewish theology is meaning organized statements about what we believe about God. Now, the Bible and the Talmud and Midrash are profoundly unorganized. So you might read an article there on biblical rabbinic thought, but here's the problem. If you've been following the idea that the way to study the Bible is along with Jack Miles with his book, God, a Biography, there's at least 20 different depictions of God in the Bible. So I don't think there is a biblical theology. There's a range of theologies in the Bible. I mean, the God of Job is quite horrific. The God in many of the Psalms is quite profoundly compassionate and healing. The God in this week's Torah portion is a God of fury. Again, I don't like to read this. I study it, especially through the Midrash. So as I read through the Bible, what I realize for myself is I have my own standard of what I feel to be closer to the God that I experience. And when it talks about a God that I don't experience, I say, well, it's interesting literature. Let me see what's going on there. So one thing I realize is most of us bring to the Bible something of a preset worldview about God. And that's why we like some parts of the Bible more and some parts of the Bible less. So when you study the Bible, someone tries to summarize all of that. It's very difficult. I think there's thought about God in the Bible. When you get to the Talmud and the Midrash, how much the more so? Some of the statements in the Talmud and Midrash are profoundly anthropomorphic and very disturbing to a person who is attached to the idea of a non-corporeal God and a monotheistic God. Well, the Bible and the Talmud don't support that. So again, you have to go in and say, well, this doesn't accord with the God that I believe in. I believe in, a God that is a spirit, does not have corporeal form, a God that emits, you might say, the natural. So therefore, when someone says do Jewish theology, as you know from last week, instead of doing Jewish theology, for example, God is creator, I would like to read those texts very carefully and realize that God is creator is not so simple. It's very complex. And then when you go in the Talmudic tradition on the creation of the universe and creation of the human being, it's even more complex. So instead of reciting theologically God is co-creator, I'd like to go deep into the text and see how this idea is fleshed out in the text. The typical divisions about God are God is creator, God is revealer of Torah, and God is redeemer. And I've read and taught that, and I'm more or less convinced that the way to teach it is to teach the multivocality of the tradition of God as creator. Not a theory about God as creator, but a presentation of all the cracks in our tradition about God as creator and revealer and as redeemer. All right, so then I remember studying Jewish medieval theology, which is Maimonides' incredible confrontation with Aristotle. Everybody should read as much of Aristotle as you can, even just a summary. It's the written record of the most brilliant mind that ever left a written record. I'm not saying the most brilliant person, the person who got a lot of it, in writing it survived through the generations. It's astounding what Aristotle did. Therefore, with the Islamic philosophers and Maimonides, when they tried to compare the Quran and the Torah and eventually the New Testament up to Aristotle, they were in trouble. So they had to create theological systems that matched a religion of revelation with the so-called religion of Aristotle, which he had more or less created by a rational ascent into the metaphysics of the divine. Now, I mastered it. I read the Guide for the Perplexed. It's profoundly impressive for me. It just didn't do anything for me spiritually. When I discovered, you might say, the discussion of God in the Kabbalah, as you know, I lit up. Now, the Kabbalah, the Zohar, is a profoundly poetic, deep, discursive text. I don't think there's anything like it on the face of the planet, I have to tell you. I'm taking a Zohar class here in Tel Aviv at a local place, gifted teacher. She's Really, I think this might be the first time I've studied it in Hebrew, and the first time I've actually taken an extended class in the Zohar, who's a person who's teaching to people for whom you don't have to translate, and people who are basically familiar with the idea as well. This teacher has taken it to very deep places. It's an amazing text. I want to bring it to you back to California. So that actually is much more fits me. So notice, I picked the theology that speaks to me the most. Metaphoric, deep, mystical, many twists and turns, many surprises, just a deep poetics about the inner life of the human being and the inner life of God. So that speaks to me. You move forward in Jewish theology, especially when you get into the 19th century, Reformed Jewish thought, conservative thought, etc., very much influenced by Kant. If you grew up in the Jewish tradition at a certain point in history, it was all about ethics. You remember that? Hegel, history. So I remember when I was growing up, it was be ethical, know your history, Kant and Hegel. So the 19th century thought was very much interpretation all the way well into the 20th century. Kant and Hegel is the background. So many books, too many books to list on Jewish ethics. And that is a part of Judaism, but I don't think the core part. I'll talk about that in a moment. So as I went through theology, I finished a book on Jewish theology just now. I realized I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I got a sense of the contours. Some stuff I loved, and some things I loved the brilliance of the writer of the chapter of the book, and I loved the brilliance of the person that they were studying, but it didn't speak to me. So after all of that, my point for today is I want our meditations on this to be meaningful to us. And therefore, we have to find the text and through the traditions that open our hearts up to God, open our hearts up to each other, lead us on a transformative journey. If that's Maimonides for you, then you should do that. It wasn't for me. There are other things to do it. As you know, for me, it's mostly the Hasidic masters. So I have decided to read books on Hasidism, books on the Baal Shem Tov, stories of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. We'll get there when I get back. Hopefully I'll do another whole year on Hasidic thought, Hasidic prayer, Hasidic theology, because it is the deepest part of my inner life. So that's what I want to put before all of you. Maybe read a book on Jewish thought. Make sure it has a chapter on Hasidic thought. Go into that, and if you enjoy that, that's something that we can talk about all the time. I want to say an extension of Hasidic thought is the archetypal study of Torah. This is something that I and Rabbi Manning talk about all the time. The idea that words have the verses of Torah, the verse of the prayer book, have incalculable depth. They reach deep down into the soul of the human being. The texts have impossibly complex, beautiful layers of interpretation. So the idea that you take a word of the Torah, for example, the word "word," I believe that Rabbi Manning talked about this last night, as the folks in my Shabbat thought today. Our Torah portion is called Elah HaDevarim. These are the words. So the Midrash, instead of going to all the things that I read today about the different places and the different kings that the people fought, if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, the Midrash does a deep dive on the word "word." What is it about words? Words of Torah. So you can read my Shabbat thought. I might come back to that this morning. So if it weren't for the Midrash, okay, I would have not sunk into a deep meditation on the idea of words and language. Now, from that, I went to the Hasidic tradition, Sfat Emet, that I just didn't have room to put in that my Shabbat thought today, is the nature of language. In fact, my favorite Hasidic author, Sfat Emet, is the language of truth. So notice in the tradition, in this Torah portion, we take one word, basically the name of the Torah portion, the second word, Elah HaDevarim, these are the words, and a deep dive into the idea of words and language. I'll come back to that in a little while. So instead of doing theology, I believe that we should have a few things in mind about what text we like the most, and then find the traditions that really speak to our hearts. I want to say in addition to that, they break our hearts. There are sometimes when I'm studying something, I should also include Musar books about Jewish moral psychology, the virtues that we should master and the flaws we should avoid. And some of these texts are profoundly deep. I want to teach that this year as well. And sometimes I've read these things and I look at myself and I'm saying to myself, I'm not living like I should. I'm not meeting the standard. And some sense of real motivation. I have to change the way I think, the way I speak, the way I talk, the way I behave. And I've been doing that since I was in my 20s. And I thank God I discovered Musar literature in my 20s, because I think the growth I've had as a human being, I think I've had some, has been propelled by my study of Musar and Hasidut. I can come back to that at the end today. So that's, again, my discovering in this wide range of Jewish texts, the texts that speak to me the most. Okay, put that aside now, maybe come back to that. So as I've talked to people about Jewish theology, I recently had a discussion with a person in a 12-step program who said to me, this idea of turning my life and will over to God, it just doesn't work for me. I don't understand that. And he said, and it's getting in the way of my working at the program. So many of you know that when I looked at that, I decided that's just not real to me. I think I understand it for people for whom it worked. That's great. It would not work for me if I were in a 12-step program. And about a third of the people whom I've worked with in 12-step programs, I taught a weekly session, many private clients, about a third of them, that idea did not work for them either. Okay, so I wanted to just pare down to the minimum theology and build up from there. So if you ever have a theological question, I want you to start with two thoughts and then build on that. The first thought is, are there truly, really better and worse answers to moral questions? So here's a little sleight of hand I oftentimes see in people who said they're secular atheists. All morality is just a consensus. There's no real morality. And then a little bit later, they're making some moral stand. In fact, I've seen people who've actually written books. Morality is only about human opinion. And then I give them speeches filled with moral outrage. And I think to myself, well, which are they? Are they the thoroughgoing moral relativist that says it's just relative to you, to your culture? Moral words have no meaning, they say kind of smugly. But as I look at what else this person talks about, that's not the way they talk about moral things. The first thing, again, I don't want to focus on this one person too much. I heard Sam Harris many years ago. He's a very smart guy. And he's done a lot of good by getting people to think. That's wonderful. But he said something about morality is simply human opinion. And then I heard him on the radio railing about the deficiencies of Islam as if it was, truly morally outrageous. He hated Islam. First of all, I didn't think that was right. There's some things in Islam. It's not a billion Muslims. And he clearly had a moral point of view. So I was thinking to myself as I was listening to the radio, I think this would be for a podcast, which is it? Is it there's no moral reality, so why do we care what people do because there's no right and wrong? Or is it that there is right and wrong, and we detect someone doing something really wrong, we should call them out? Now, Harris, many years later, wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, where he became a utilitarianism, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. But my critique of that idea is just try to imagine what it would mean to poll 325 million Americans and find out what the greatest good for the greatest number is. It's a fantastical idea that we could ever create a consensus of what the good is, what the greatest good is for what number of people and what are the limits. So people say the greatest good for the greatest number. I say, well, it would be great if 51% of people made slaves out of 49% of the people. I mean, we're the greatest number, 51%. We'd all have a few slaves, and that would be the best version. No, that's not what I mean. You can't be 51%. I say, what percentage is it? And what about these other people? Do they have human rights? Can we trample over them? Yes, they have rights. So I realized that every time I've had one of these conversations with a utilitarian, greatest good for the greatest number, it really falls when one does some real moral analysis of right and wrong, good and bad. So again, I studied utilitarianism carefully in graduate school. I just don't think it has strong legs for true moral analysis of the moral struggles that you have and I have. When I have a moral struggle, I don't ask myself, greatest good for the greatest number. It's not what I ask myself. I ask myself how much good, whatever role I have in the situation, how much good I can create, which means I have to ask myself, do I believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions? So I do. I really believe, now I'm not saying I know what the question is, I don't know what the answer is, but there's a way to get closer to it. I don't think ever in my life, whenever I had a moral question, I asked myself, greatest good for the greatest number. I don't think that ever occurred to me to ask. Now, even before I knew anything about natural law theory, I did ask myself, what is the right thing to do here? How much good can I create? So the first question we all have to ask is, are there better and worse answers to moral questions in your own life, your interpersonal life, your family life, your professional life, everywhere you go where a moral question gets raised? Is there a better and worse answer to a moral question? Now, if you say no, then you should log off and go get some moral realism therapy and come back later. Just kidding, stay on as long as you want. I don't think it's tenable. I don't think it's tenable to say there are not better and worse answers to moral questions, because if you take that as far as you want to go, it's really, it permits horrific things, because there is no moral restraint. There is no moral restraint. If everything is equal, there's no moral reality. Right? When people who think that way have taken power, it is utterly horrific. So I think the future of the world is based on societies that are convinced that there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and we try to figure that out as well as we can. That's the first question. So whenever you're asked, what is your theology? What do you believe about God? You say, well, are there better and worse answers to moral questions? Yes. What is the standard that determines what's better or worse? Now, you don't have to say the word God, but it can't be what any human being thinks, because we're back to, it's all relative to the human being. So I don't think that what I think is better or worse. I'm trying to find my way to the answer. So you have to start with, there are better and worse answers to moral questions. I don't know if I have the right answer, but I want to work. So what is the question left to us? Since there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and since it is not a collection of what the majority of human beings think at any given moment, that's out. It has to be something beyond the will of human beings. That's the only option with which we are left. So therefore, I have to say, ask myself, how do I connect with the standard that is beyond human will? Okay, we call that the conscience. Okay, the conscience is the interface between the standard of right and wrong, good and bad, and the interior of the human life. You don't have to call it God, call it anything you want. I've recommended the metaphysical standard for right and wrong, if you want that. The MSRW, metaphysical standard for right and wrong. You don't have to call it God, but when I say God, that's part of what I mean by God. The metaphysical standard for right and wrong, because it is not a consensus of what a group of human beings think. That's obviously cannot what we mean by moral. Okay, that's the first question. So anytime you're asked, what do you believe? In my opinion, start there. I believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions. It is not determined by any group of human beings. Therefore, it has to be in some metaphysical realm. How do you know? I don't know. People say to me, how do I know? I said, I don't know, but I've made an existential choice, because either I can choose that there are not better and worse answers to moral questions, and therefore there's no moral restraint for anybody anywhere. Greatest good for the greatest number is not going to answer a moral question. Okay, I can make that choice, because there's no way to know. I think you just have a choice to make. Or I've made the choice, the existential choice, that there are better and worse answers to moral questions, which means now I must go and study. I'm going to go and figure out, well, what is a moral question? How do I figure this out? Can I train my conscience to know God better? You see, if you pick the answer, there is not, that leads you in one direction, and I don't think it's morally fruitful at all. If you believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions, you're going to go down this road. It's a way better road to go down. But again, I'll leave that all up to you. You have to make that choice yourselves. I've made that choice. Therefore, the way I think about morals is different from a person for whom there are not any better and worse answerable questions. It's just human convention, human fabrication. Now, the second question I think we should all ask is, implied in the first, can we connect to it? Which means, is it theoretical, meaning there's a law, but we can't know it? There is a metaphysical standard, but we can't experience it. So the next question is, now that I know speaking for myself, there is a metaphysical standard for better and worse, right and wrong, good and bad. Can I be in contact with it? All the way from, can I connect to it? Can my conscience connect to it? To, can my soul connect to it? Now, when I've gone into those soul dimensions of something happened to me that, again, I don't think this is required, but I felt the presence. I felt what the Kabbalah calls a shefa, the overflow of the divine pouring into me. So the third, I don't think you have to believe, I'm just going to tell you, is what happened to me when I took the second one seriously. When I asked myself, can I be in contact with it? It's as if a sluice opened up and the presence of the divine just washed into me. And then I realized, for me, well, that's the point of religion. The point of religion is to create a text, a community, traditions, and so forth, that can, number one, lead us to moral realism, that can also lead us to the chambers of the heavens opening up and pouring down into us the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. So I think those are the 2.5 questions. Is there a moral standard? Can we connect to it? And if so, can there be a spiritual connection? Okay, I'll make that the third question. Is there a moral standard? Can we connect to it? Can we create a spiritual connection to it? So anytime anybody says to me, what's your theology? This is where I start. So therefore, when people say to me, do I believe in God? What they usually mean is, do I believe in the miracles of the Hebrew Bible? Because they want to play a gotcha game. I say, well, what does that mean? Well, do you believe the Red Sea parted? I said, that's not, if I do or don't, that's not the core of my beliefs. It's actually very, very far away from any belief that I care about. So I consider myself a God knower, which leads to number 2 and number 3. Can you see that? When I say I'm a knower of God, it means I'm one of those who have reached up and met the divine through conscience, and then met the divine through spirit. So I consider myself a God knower. So my belief would be, I believe the human being can know God. And one of the ways we know God is through contact with what is morally better and worse. So when everybody says to me, what do you believe? I say these 3 things. But I focus on the knowledge of God, not beliefs about God, except for that God exists, that God is the standard for morally better and worse. From my experience, we can spiritually connect to whatever we want to call that, and can it flow into us? So hopefully I've said enough about that. So for the person who asked me in the 12-step program and said, do I turn my will and my life over to God? What I said is, that just doesn't fit with anything that I just said. Meaning for me, this profoundly complex inner life where I'm trying to get this divine spirit to operate in every chamber of my being, what does it mean to turn that over to God? Meaning I'm not turning anything over to God, I'm inviting God in. Is that what they mean? As if there's a compartment in me that I turn it over to God, and then I don't have any will anymore. I turn my life and my will over to God. So God's going to will things for me. I don't believe it's that simple, because there are many people who believe they're doing what God tells them to do. And I don't think that has anything to do with what God's will is. So the idea, I'm turning my life and will over to God, I think it's okay to get you into a 12-step program, but that doesn't work for very long. That I have turned my life and will over to God. Well, you are in there. Your life and will. So when a person says, let go and let God, I don't think that answers a question. I think what it means is, get your egocentrism out of the way. I get that, but that's not God. It's a different part of the human being. So for this person says, let go, let God, turn your life over to God, I said, here's what I think it means. There's a part of the inner life that is aggressive, rigid, chaotic, filled with cravings, confused, hurt, and lives their life based on that broken part of the human being. And for many people, that controls their lives. And then you may look at this and say to yourself, some meta thought that says, I don't want to live that way anymore. Now, either because you brought horror into your life through addictions, or even without an addiction. You say, I'm just too miserable. I'm making other people miserable. So you have a meta thought, a thought about your thoughts, and say, I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to live with anger, with hatred, with the stuff that Tisha B'Av condemns. So you say, I don't want to be that. Now, I don't say I'm turning it over to God. I've made a willful decision not to be that person. Now, once I've decided not to be that person, I have to change my inner life habits. Okay. As opposed to habits of anger, resentment, guilt, shame, victimhood. There's a whole set of inner life habits that I realize those are my habits. I go to a higher place. I look at my habits, and there's some metaphysical standard where I change my habits. Now, I don't feel I've turned my will over to God. I feel what I've done is, as it were, connected with the divine, and the divine then empowers me to use my will to change my life. I'm not turning my will over to God. I'm asking the divine, when I get up to that level of consciousness, that my will be strengthened by the divine will. Now, that's different for me. For me to look at a problem, meditate up as far as I can, feel the divine presence, and ask. I was in Jerusalem yesterday or the day before, and I went to the wall. When you go to the wall and you put your hands on the wall, you're going to say a true prayer. That's what happens to me. I try to say a true prayer no matter what, but you look at the wall and you look at all the history of our people and our tradition, and it's, all the heartbreak, and you walk up and everything comes together. And I just apologize that I haven't lived up to my own standard. I want to channel the divine, and I completely commit myself to learning what the divine wants of me and channeling the divine into the world. And that's what my prayer ended up becoming. Not that I turn my will over to God, but the divine, as it were, flow into me so that I can will myself for inner transformation. I hope that the distinction between the two is I've made them clear enough. So this theological idea, for me, is better than let go, let God, turn my life and will over to God, but rather connect with the higher standard, meditate up into it, try to observe my life from that standard, and then invite it down into my life. One last thing I want to say, as far as we're talking about this, is the attraction of Eastern religion. And I think I've told the story enough, but there might be somebody new today who never heard this story. It'll amaze me if that's true. But, when I was growing up, I asked my parents, what religion are we? And my mom said, well, born Jewish, don't believe in it. My dad said, lapsed Catholic, don't believe in it. I said, what do I do? Anything you want. So I read Houston Smith's book, The Religions of Man. I think that's what it's called. I did not know that he was a Buddhist when he wrote it. Now I know that. I get it now. I read the chapter on Buddhism, and I think hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in my generation decided for Eastern religion, because Western religion, traditional Christianity, and Judaism, mostly in North America, it wasn't taught spiritually. And again, I'm gonna blame the American rabbinate for that. Something I would like to fix. Hebrew school, everything I heard from a rabbi, nothing spoke to my soul. So I read this chapter in Houston Smith's The Religions of Man on Buddhism. Until I discovered Kabbalah and Hasidism, it was the deepest thing I had ever read. So I said, I want to do that. I think I've told everybody that not long after that, I saw a Buddhist immolating himself on the streets of Saigon. And I thought to myself, okay, that's a little bit too serious. Don't want to go that far. So I might be not so all in, right? I really didn't know. I mean, I read about Buddhism. That's the first time I saw Buddhism on television, lit on fire. That was a very disturbing thing for a little kid to see on the, on the 6 o'clock news. But, whenever I thought about religion, spirituality, going through Hebrew school and so forth, I had that Buddhist idea. And part of the Buddhist idea is it teaches there's a kind of that thought is an illusion, and we could connect ourselves to a nothingness to overcome the monkey mind of illusion. But I then also learned that Buddhism has a very well-developed ethical system. So I try to think about that. If nothing is real and everything's an illusion, why do we have the Eightfold Path? Why do we have so many different Buddhist teachers teaching about virtue and ethics and consciousness and service and prayer and so many other beautiful things if nothing is real? I said, okay, I don't demand that anybody be coherent because I can't make any claim to coherency. But I said to myself, which do I prefer? Studying the righteous path of the path of mind and the path of thinking well, the path of virtue and righteousness and service and prayer, or do I want to meditate into nothingness? What I realized is, I don't mind meditating into nothingness now and then, but I mostly want to study how to translate this into character. So when people talk about the Buddhist tradition, and you might say the tradition of nothingness, we have that in our tradition. There are Kabbalistic prayers that are completely mind emptying, completely focused on the experience of connecting to ultimate reality with no thought. That is in our tradition. No one ever told me that. No one ever taught it to me. People want to know, do we have that? We absolutely have it. Look at Abraham Abulafia, just for one person. Now, I own Abulafia's text. I've read them. I've studied them. They're not, I'd rather study the Zohar, which is a thinking person's text. But when you think about it, you go to extraordinary places. I have to share with you, I'm in a class where the gifted teacher teaching a Zohar, and an incredible section full of delightful surprises. And I just had this feeling, I felt the Shekhinah in the room. I saw that I felt everybody's hearts opening up because of a sudden turn. The text took a turn, and the teacher took us around the turn. And the turn's it's just a heart opening. And I kind of glanced around the room, and everybody had a quasi-stunned look on their faces. And the teacher noticed and stopped. I just closed my eyes and I said, we've invited the Shekhinah in here. I could just feel her come in the room and rest, maybe for a second or two, and then lift. And I was wondering if the teacher was going to say anything. And I think she wisely chose not to, because we would have never gotten back to the text. But you see how that can happen? For me, when you study Zohar and all of its layers of complexity, it's a difficult text. But now and then when you take a turn, something amazing happens. Now, because it is such a difficult text, Hasidism, they try to do this in the Hasidic sermon. So instead of studying this extraordinarily difficult text of the Zohar, the vocabulary is limited, the ideas are profound. The Hasidim said, we're going to do it through the Hasidic sermon. So that's what Sfat Emet is. So for me, these are heart-opening kinds of texts. So do we have what we find in Patanjali, I think in either Hinduism or Buddhism, I'm forgetting which, the moral spiritual paths of Eastern religions? Do we have what the Sufis teach? Everything that every other religion has, we have. The question, if you have to ask yourself, what am I interested in deeply? And do I want to learn it both outside my tradition and also inside my tradition? So I study, as you know, I've studied Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and Hindu texts. I've studied so many, but I always want to come back to my tradition and find it here. Why? Because I'm comfortable here. I like it. People say, why are you Jewish? And I said, it's never got bad enough that I had to leave. So it's okay. Like a good enough mother, it's a good enough religion. Why would I make through all the tsuris of changing my religion? And well, what about this? What about that? Yeah, I get it. But we have everything here. It's full. It's like we're an underground chamber filled with boutiques, and you can shop in any spiritual boutique you want. You don't have to go over to the next cave system. It's all in our cave system. So leave me alone. I'm happy where I am. Don't try to talk me out of it. So that's what I want to say. Is just anything that I find in any other religion I study, I say, do we have those kinds of thoughts over here? Absolutely. So, because I think Eastern religion has been a big challenge to Judaism, partly because Judaism has been so poorly taught for so long. I just hope the damage is not irreversible. If I have anything to do with it, we're going to reverse the trend, turn the tide, and we're all going to find our way into the enchanted forest of Jewish texts. All right, so to sum up, I think you should all become familiar with Jewish philosophy. See what they have to say. So if you hear Maimonides or Saadia or Buber or Heschel, and then you should be like, well, I really like what Heschel has to say. I've never had a bad moment reading Heschel. I've never had a bad moment reading Buber. But who inspired Heschel and Buber? Hasidism. You want to know what created the Buberian consciousness? Hasidism. You want to know who shaped Abraham Joshua Heschel's worldview that produced his wonderful books? Hasidism. So that's why I would say, great, study Heschel, study Buber, but eventually, start to go into the world of Hasidic texts. All right.